TV captions are great, especially for older folks like us with mild hearing issues. But here's the deal. My wife and I love watching Matlock. No, not the old Matlock, but the new one with Kathy Bates. Now that show is very fast-paced with multiple characters and always a double storyline. The captions help, but then they often cover up critical parts of the screen, especially because we set them to be pretty large. I got this idea to somehow figure out a way to get the captions on a separate screen, maybe one we could put closer to the couch, one that we could read when we needed to and not be inconvenienced by having captions on the main screen. That turned out to be a lot harder than it sounds.
But wait, there's more.
There's a solution, and it's hiding in plain sight right on my ever-present iPad. So stay tuned to find out what I discovered and an unexpected problem that made me feel like Big Brother was always listening while we were watching TV and chatting.
Welcome to Apple EDC.
I'm just tickled over this one. It turns out that there's a built-in app for iPad and for iPhone called Live Captions. It's in the accessibility section, and here's what it does. Once activated, it listens for audio and transcribes it into text in real time, right there on your screen. It's great because the transcription rolls up and doesn't just disappear. So if something is moving a little too fast, you can always pause the video and just look on the transcribed captions on your iPad or your iPhone to figure out what you might have missed. Now to set it up, let's go to Settings, then Accessibility. Now let's scroll down until we see Live Captions. Let's tap on that, and then let's just turn Live Captions on. It's that simple. Now if we want, we can adjust the appearance by changing the text boldness, the size, as well as the text color and the background color. You can make the text window larger by tapping the expansion icon. That makes it full screen on your phone. On your iPad, you get an adjustable window. Now all of this is pretty cool, but you may have noticed that the captioning transcription is on your screen, and of course, you may not always want that. So by tapping the back arrow, you can minimize the screen to an icon. But it turns out the app is still listening.
I'm listening.
To stop it from listening, you have to tap the little microphone, then select Pause Listening, then select the back arrow to minimize to an icon. And then you still have the icon on your screen. I find that to be very inconvenient. So of course, I wrote a few very simple shortcuts, and then I put bookmarks to them on my home screen. These start and stop the Live Captions app with one tap. Problem solved. I put links to these shortcuts in the description, so let's go to those links and I'll show you how to download and install these very simple little shortcuts on your device, and how to add bookmarks to your home screen. Now I'll use my iPad for this demo, but it works pretty much the same way on an iPhone as well. From the description for this video, let's go ahead and tap on our Live Captions On link, and when it downloads, it shows us that we have our Live Captions shortcut ready to go, and that it works with Siri. So let's just tap where it says Add Shortcut. Now for me, it says replace or keep both because I've already got it on my iPad. I'll say keep both for now, and it's installed in my shortcut library. But sometimes, once you download a shortcut, it will return you to the shortcut gallery view. If that happens, just switch to the library view, and there you see it right at the top. Live Captions On. Now let's tap the three ellipses at the top, and then I'm going to add it to my home screen by tapping the little share box. You can see there's an add to home screen option, so I'll tap that. Then I'll go find whatever symbol I want. I want to use the little up caret, and I'm going to say add, and then we see our bookmark on our home screen. If you don't see your bookmark, it may have been placed on a different home screen than you thought, so just swipe through your screens until you find it, and then you can move it wherever you want by tapping it and holding it, and then just dragging it to the home screen of your choice. Now just repeat those steps for the Live Captions Off shortcut, and you're ready to start using it. By the way, I like to have my little bookmarks down at the bottom of my iPad home screen so they don't get covered up when I'm using the Live Captions app on my iPad. I adjusted that window so the two little bookmarks are visible like so. Okay, let's see this in action while watching TV. I just prop my iPad up on the coffee table and activate live captioning using the shortcut. Then when we're done watching, I just use the other shortcut to stop the app.
That could be the reason why the ramp collapsed. The forensic engineer looked over every inch of that truck. If there were a leak, he would have seen it.
These two little shortcuts make using live captions very quick and easy. But there's another problem. What happens if we talk while we're watching TV? Well, you guessed it.
I'm listening.
Our conversation is transcribed as well. That's a bummer. But after a, well, not so brief moment of frustration, I decided to try plugging in a little inexpensive Bluetooth wireless mic I had laying around. I don't think it's available on Amazon anymore, but I'll put a link in the description to a similar one that's on Amazon. So I'm going to plug that into the little USB-C port on my iPad like so, and then just power it on. And there we go, it's on. So before I start the live captions, I'm going to speak very softly into the microphone just to verify that the microphone is what this is hearing and it's not picking up my voice on the built-in iPad microphone. So let's go ahead and give it a try. We'll turn live captions on. Okay, I'm speaking very softly. Can you hear me now? 1, 2, 3. Okay, I was whispering, so it definitely is picking me up on this little microphone right here. So I just set this right underneath the speakers on the TV, and that way the live captions hears this little microphone. My wife and I can sit and chat on the couch and it doesn't pick our conversation up. And sure enough, we were far enough away that the microphone only picked up the TV audio and we could talk away without the annoyance of having Big Brother caption everything we said. Now, if you'd like a printed guide on how to set up live captioning and how to make the shortcuts yourself, please check the description. It's a great way to help support this channel. I hope you found this one useful, and if you did, please consider giving us a thumbs up and leaving a comment if you have any ideas or suggestions, or if you just want to say hi. As always, thanks for watching, and we'll see you on the next one. Bye for now.